Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be talking about all of the books that I read in July. I read 11 books in July, which I'm pretty happy about. I'm just going to talk to you about what I read, mostly in chronological order. Like, it's going to go kind of chronological order, and then the books that I read for the reading rush, and then some of my favorite books that I read this month that I was pretty excited about. The first book we're going to talk about is Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. Something I didn't realize until I was well into reading this book is that Mansfield Park was the last of Austen's novels that I had to read before having read all of her novels, which I find kind of interesting because I don't think of Jane Austen as like a favorite author of mine. I think when I think about classic, well-known women writers, I much prefer the work that the Bronte sisters wrote. But anyway, this is about Fanny Price, who has some really rich relatives who are like, hey, your mom is not that well off and has had too many children. We are going to take you in and like take care of you. So it's about Fanny and her relationship with her aunt and uncle and her cousins, and it's about love, courtship, as most of Austen's novels are about. Who are these ladies gonna marry? That's the big question. I then read a poetry collection, Mad Women by Gabriela Mistral, translated by Randall Couch. So Gabriela Mistral was a Chilean poet, and this is just a translation of some of her poems from, I think, her last collection, and then two uncollected poems. So I picked this up at Shakespeare and Company in Paris when I visited in 2018 while I was studying abroad in London. So it has the stamp and everything. Very exciting. I was really happy that I ended up picking this up and that I enjoyed it. Admittedly, the whole reason that I selected this was the title. I find that the theme of mad women really interesting and fascinating, specifically when we think historically or like about classics that we read that have like the mad woman and how she's characterized. So that was what drew me in, just the title. So I didn't really know what this was about. But the poems in here, they feel very mythic. A lot of them have to do with grief. Many of them were written after her adoptive son died. There are also some poems in here that are inspired by the Greek myths of Cassandra and Clytemnestra. My favorite poems were The Storyteller and The Pious Woman. I read The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas and was disappointed in myself for not picking this up sooner. It's something that came out 4 or 5 years ago and was really popular for very good reasons. It's about Star, who is a Black teenager who is really recognizing the ways that she's living and having to like perform these different identities as she's going to this really white private school, and the Star that she is and has to be there with her friends, and then the Star she is when she's at home interacting with other people and feeling like those are two different people, even though she's one person. The book starts with her and a good friend of hers driving home from a party, and they are stopped by a policeman who ends up killing her best friend. So it's about that. It's about police brutality. It's about friendship. It's about identity and activism. And I fully enjoyed it. And was happy that I was able to finally get to it. Okay, on to the books that I read for the reading rush. I completed 6 books. I'm going to talk about 5 right now in no particular order, kind of just the way they're stacked. So I read Call the Midwife, a memoir of birth, joy, and hard times by Jennifer Worth. This is a book that I picked up because I had watched the PBS series. You can see this is the series tie-in. I also listened to this on audiobook. Anyway, this is the memoir of a woman who worked as a midwife after the Second World War in London's East End, and talks about the women that she worked with, the nuns that she worked with. The school that she went to for midwifery was a convent, and it also details the interactions that Jennifer had with pregnant women, some of whom were more well off than others. There were moments in the book that felt very surface level, but I also was really happy that I picked this up because I don't think I read enough about people actually giving birth. Anyway, moving on, I read The Radical Women Manifesto, Socialist Feminist Theory, Program, and Organizational Structure. This is just the manifesto of a Seattle-based feminist organization called Radical Women, which was founded in the 60s, I want to say. And this really just outlines what they want, what they're trying to do, and I think was a good reminder for me of what socialist feminism is. Then I read another poetry collection. This is Girl with Death Mask by Jennifer Givon. This is a collection of poems that are about womanhood and being a Latinx woman and a desire to have children. I think is a really strong theme in here. This was a collection that grew on me, so the more that I read it, the more I enjoyed it. There's a poem in here inspired by Frida Kahlo, that's like formatted like this, that I really enjoyed. There we go. I then read a book that I did not really care too much about, and that was A Whole Life by Robert Seethaler, translated by Charlotte Collins. This is about a man who lives in the Austrian Alps, and it just tells us his life in this short amount of time. I just found this kind of boring. I think it reminded me of Silence in the Noise, a book that has a title with silence in it. And it also reminded me of Tinkers, which I read at the beginning of this year. In the sense of it was like those stories are all about like this one man living kind of isolated in nature. I wish this book had painted a better picture of the main character's internal and emotional life and what was going on not outside of him, whereas it kind of just felt like I was reading a bland biography. So, I don't know about you, but I always feel bad when I don't like books that have gorgeous covers, because I love this cover. I think it's beautiful. I know we shouldn't judge books by their cover, but I want pretty books to be good. I think that's normal. The last book that I'm going to talk about in this section of the books that I read for the reading rush is Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reed. I really enjoyed reading this. Typically, I don't read books that are published within the past like 3 to 5 years or sooner. So I think I had a really good time reading something that was like relevant, that its relevancy was now. This is about a young Black woman who is working as a babysitter for this white family, and the family calls her one evening and says, hey, there's been an emergency, can you take the kid to like the corner store market and just entertain her for a little bit so she doesn't have to be around while we deal with this. And the babysitter, Amira, was like, yeah, cool, of course, I'll do that. As they're at the market, a white woman notifies the security guard that she thinks stuff is going on, and Amira is accused of kidnapping the white child. So this book is about performative allyship and white people doing things with very intense ulterior motives that aren't necessarily known to them. There are 2 white characters in here that think they know what's best for Amira, and are also doing some questionable things. So I really enjoyed reading this, and it brought up a lot of questions that felt very now, as opposed to reading Mansfield Park. I'm like, class and marriage and the Regency era, whereas I think reading this makes me think, okay, what's happening currently? All right, we're now going to talk about some of my favorite books that I read this month that are like favorites and just make me really happy. It feels like I've read a lot of books that I really like in a short period of time. So these 3 books, plus The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy that I read last month, I just adored. The first book I want to talk about is also the first book that I read this month, and that is Written on the Body by Jeanette Winterson. Oh my god, there's a bookmark in here. I've been looking for this. This is a book about an unnamed main character whose gender is never disclosed, and their relationship with this woman that they love. And like, saying that, I'm like, okay, that's a basic plot premise. I love this book for a lot of reasons. One, it felt so queer. Like, yes, it's never disclosed the gender of the narrator, so that allows a little bit of flexibility of like the readers could say, okay, this narrator is non-binary, this narrator is a man, this narrator is a woman. And I think like that gender ambiguity of the narrator was so great. I have read a book before that tried to do a similar thing, Sphinx by Anne Garretta, which is, I think, kind of flipped. Neither the main character nor the love interest, like that their genders are never disclosed and that their names are kind of weirdly not disclosed either. But this, I'm just rambling and I don't know how to tell you how good this is. So, okay, I liked it for how queer it felt without having to be explicitly like, this is a woman and a woman who are in love, or this is someone who's like gender non-conforming and a woman, or like without having to put a specific label on it. It felt very queer. How many times can I say that? I don't know. I also loved all the literary allusions that were in this. I read this at the beginning of the month, so I'm going to forget. Like, I can't currently tell you who this book alludes to, but it does. It also does this thing of referring back to itself that's really well done, of like repetitions of lines throughout, which is part of like disclosing memory and part of disclosing thoughts and feelings that are hanging over. The other thing that makes me love this is something that is a theme or an idea that I just adore, and that's the body. As a creative person, as a dancer, as a choreographer, as anything, I am hyper focused on this idea of like studying the body and studying its movements. And this has a section that is broken up into parts of the body. And I got to that and I was like, I thought this book was perfect already. And it just is. It's so good. I love the writing style. It reminds me of Bluets by Maggie Nelson, which is set up in vignettes. This isn't set up in vignettes, but it felt very similar. And that book also is about like losing love. So there are some like similar connections. If you like Bluets, read this. A book I read during the reading rush that I absolutely loved came at the recommendation of a really good friend of mine from college who I was in a feminist theory course with. And at the end of that course, we were asked to do like a feminist theory, feminist writing show and tell, where we all went around and we were like, you know, this is something that I think everyone should read that we didn't read in this class. And she brought up Exiled Pride, Disability, Queerness, and Liberation by Eli Clare. Eli Clare is a trans person who has cerebral palsy and grew up in Port Orford, Oregon, moved then to, I'm forgetting where, but to a bigger city. Writes about queerness writes about disability, writes about the place of class in feminist theory and gender studies. This was so good. I had read sections of this in previous gender studies classes. Each chapter is kind of its own individual essay. So there are one or two that I've read selections of. Eli Clare writes and tackles a lot of things in this book, and it's short. It's like, this is not a tome. He talks about how the LGBTQ plus movement can't and shouldn't be demonizing rural working class people, and that the environmentalist movement shouldn't be demonizing working class people who work in industries that contribute to environmental harm. He talks about the history of the freak show and its place in the narratives of disabled people, people with bodily disfigurements or bodily difference, and people of color in the US, and the monetization and exploitation of those bodies. He does a lot. It's good. I think this is essential feminist reading. I think this is essential queer reading. I think this is essential reading. Please read this. That's what I have to say. The last book I'm going to talk about is not necessarily like my favorite of like the three of these. They're all kind of good for different reasons and mean different things to me. But I have to talk about Lincoln and the Bardo by George Saunders. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. That's the truth. I did not know what I was getting myself into. This is about the death of Lincoln's son, Willie, who dies as the Lincolns are holding a party in 1862. And I wasn't prepared. This made me feel so sad, so melancholy, because this takes us into a graveyard where Willie is buried and the bodies, the people who reside there. And it does so in this huge like collage of voices. So in the setting of this graveyard, the sections are written so that it goes between the voices of the people who are there. So each voice will get between like a line and a paragraph, and then it'll switch and tell the story. And it didn't feel clunky. It didn't feel jarring. It was so good. But then there are also these parts that look more into Lincoln as someone who's grieving, as the president during the Civil War. And it provides these historical accounts from documents set up in the same way of like a paragraph or a couple of lines and then a switch. And like that's how we learn about Lincoln. So it feels like this really neat meshing of fiction and historical documents. Probably one of my favorite sections in here is the description of Abraham Lincoln's eyes, because it's like 3 pages. I can't even tell you how many different lines or sections that there are within those 3 pages, and they're all describing his eyes differently. Like some of them are like it's blue-gray, others are like it's like brown, or like he had gray eyes, and it blew my mind. The tone of the book is super low. Again, the melancholy, the sadness, grief, a child has died. But the intellectual process of reading this was so strong. It was so good. Anyway, please let me know what your favorite books that you read in July were. I'm really happy with what I read. Thanks for joining me. Again, I hope you're having a really good day, and I'll see you in another video.